While I was cleaning up my father's vomit at 3 in the morning, my eyes burning with sleep and my hands shaking with exhaustion, she was uploading photos of us on a terrace in Paris, a glass of white wine in her hand and her foot crossed over the railing as if the world didn't exist. She was smiling. She was glowing. Her makeup was flawless. The background was the illuminated Eiffel Tower. Mine was a bathroom that smelled of sour medicine and dried sweat. I watched her on the screen while I held my father's head, which could no longer hold itself up, and I felt something I'd never felt before. Disgust. Not for her. For me. For having reached that point. For having allowed love to enslave me. I never imagined that the deepest pain wouldn't come from an unexpected tragedy or an incurable illness, but from the shared silence of betrayal. And the worst part is that that betrayal came with her name, with her blood, with her perfect smile that always knew how to hide the truth behind every gesture. We had grown up in the same house, with the same parents, the same fears, the same Christmases of aluminum foil and reheated rice. But something went wrong along the way. She learned to escape. I learned to stay. And over time, that became routine. She flew. I cared. She lived. I survived. And I don't say this with resentment. I say it with the voice of someone who no longer has the strength to lie to herself. Social media has that slow poison that creeps in without you noticing. I started seeing his photos more and more often. Florence, Bali, Dubai, each one with more sparkle, more filters, more likes. Meanwhile, my world shrank to a clock that beeped every 4 hours to give him the medicine, a routine that included changing adult diapers, and sleepless nights because he screamed like he was still 20 years old and in a war. Once, while I was bathing him, he looked me in the eyes and said I was pretty. He didn't recognize me. He called me by another name, a name that wasn't mine. I cried silently because I couldn't even tell him that I was his daughter, that I was there for him, that I had given up everything to take care of him, that I never left. But what was the point of saying it if he could no longer understand? And while that was happening, she was posting on her Instagram stories a dinner on a luxury cruise, dishes impossible to pronounce, wines that cost more than my entire salary, with soft music in the background, a measured smile, and hashtags that said things like dream life, I deserve it, eternal traveler. And yes, the worst part is that she believed she deserved it, as if abandonment could be justified with a 5-star hotel reservation. I ate leftovers. Sometimes I didn't eat at all. I preferred to use that money for diapers, gas, and medicine. I memorized the discounts at every pharmacy. I became friends with the woman at the counter who would let me know when the sales were coming. My clothes always smelled of disinfectant. My nails were broken from washing so much. And my back screamed every night from the weight of carrying a man who could no longer walk. No one knew, because I didn't tell anyone, because I believed loving in silence was more courageous. But now I say it, with rage, with pain, with that bitter mix of wounded dignity and accumulated fatigue. Because while she used our father's money to pay for massages in Thailand, I pushed him in a rusty wheelchair someone donated to us because we couldn't afford to buy a new one. And every time someone told me how lucky your father is to have you, I smiled with a silent sadness. Because yes, he had it. But at what cost? No one asked about me. No one offered to help. And when she called, once a month, it was to say she was very busy, that the Wi-Fi in Greece was bad, that she couldn't talk much, that she loved him, that she thanked me for taking care of him. And then, silence. I became a ghost in my own life. I no longer knew who I was. My name faded like the memories of my father. I existed only to serve, to sustain, to endure, to pretend everything was okay while the world crumbled through my fingers. And meanwhile, she celebrated her 40th birthday in a private villa in Santorini, with golden balloons and fireworks. I remember the night something inside me snapped. It was winter. It was cold. We didn't have heat because we couldn't afford the electric bill. We slept in coats. He was coughing. I hugged him. And while I was searching for an extra blanket in the closet, my phone vibrated. It was a new photo of her, in a jacuzzi overlooking the ocean, with a text that said, Living is urgent. And that's when I understood. She lived. I didn't. The vomit I cleaned up that morning wasn't the worst of it. It was looking at his photos with my hands still dirty, my stomach empty, my feet wet because the bathroom heater was broken, and feeling like all that effort, all that sacrifice, was invisible. That no one saw it, that no one appreciated it, that it was me against the world. And yet I kept doing it, because I loved him, because I didn't know how to live any other way. It was never about money. It was never about who did more or who gave less. It was about respect, about loyalty, about not betraying the man who gave us life. But she found the cruelest way to do it. And she did it with a smile, with a glass of wine in her hand, with a first-class ticket paid for with the card of a man who no longer even remembered his PIN number. And there I was, in the dark, with my eyes open, waiting for the medicine bell to ring again, waiting for him to say my name, even if it was by mistake, waiting for someone to see me. My name is Helena Margaret Collins. I am 46 years old and was born in a small town in Indiana, where I still live, although I am no longer the same woman who used to walk these streets with her head full of dreams and her heart still intact. Today, my house smells of medicine, reheated coffee, and silence. And while I have learned to live with this strange mix of fragility and routine, I never imagined this would be the landscape of my days. It wasn't a choice. It was a consequence. Like when a crack opens in a wall little by little, and by the time you realize it, it's too late to repair it. My story doesn't begin with obvious trauma or an unexpected twist. It begins with small details, with the way time pushes you into roles you never asked for. From a young age, I became accustomed to caring. First, it was my mother's nervous breakdown. Then, my younger sister's crying in the early mornings. Then my father's when he started forgetting simple things like the day of the week or where he'd left his car keys. I've always been that person. The one who stays. The one who holds. The one who fixes what others let fall. I worked for many years as a home health aide. I cared for the elderly, the terminally ill, and patients with reduced mobility. I learned to read glances, interpret silences, and distinguish between physical pain and emotional wounds. I saw people die who had no one to look after. I saw children who didn't visit their parents, not even on their deathbeds, and that left a profound mark on me. I swore to myself that if my parents ever needed me, I wouldn't leave them alone. I never married. I never had children. Some people say it was a calling. Others say it was fear. The truth is, I never felt like there was room for me in my own days. When you work caring for others, time becomes a luxury. Sometimes I would go weeks without having a conversation that wasn't related to medications, assisted bathing, or bland diets. My days were functional, and for some reason I still don't fully understand, that made me feel useful, important. I still remember my old bicycle. It was blue with white stripes and a worn seat. I used it to go from one house to another, in sun or snow, with a backpack full of gloves, gauze, syringes, and medical papers. I felt like a trench soldier, ready to fight against oblivion, decay, and neglect. Sometimes patients waited for me with a hot cup of tea, and other times they didn't even recognize me. But I never missed a day, not a single day, because I knew that for many, I was the only person who opened the door with a smile. My father used to say I had the softest hands in the world, that when I put a blanket on his legs, it felt like time had stopped. He was a strong man, one of those who didn't know how to ask for help, but thanked with a look. And although he was never very expressive, every time he silently ran his hand over my head, I understood that he loved me in his own way. After my mother died, the house grew quieter. My sister left the state. She moved to the West Coast, searching for something even she couldn't explain. I stayed. I took care of the burial, the paperwork, the laundry, the unopened letters piling up in the kitchen. And when everything was in order, I didn't feel I should leave. I felt I should stay. For him. For the memories. For everything she left behind without looking at. The garden became my refuge. I planted lavender, rosemary, and geraniums. I mowed the grass every week. I painted the fence white. People passing by said it was the most well-kept house in the neighborhood. but they didn't know it was also the loneliest. When I watered the plants, I thought about how water finds its way into even the driest cracks. And that's how I felt, like a root searching for a reason to keep growing amidst neglect. Back then, every morning began with a cup of black coffee and a to-do list. Check Dad's vital signs, prepare his salt-free breakfast, administer his pills, read him a chapter of his favorite book even if he couldn't remember the previous one, take him out onto the porch so he could feel the sun, and repeat it all the next day. There was no room for improvisation. My life was measured in alarms, the one for medication, the one for diaper changes, the one for blood pressure checks. Some nights I sat in the rocking chair next to his bed and watched him sleep. His face was a mixture of peace and absence, as if he were in another time, another place. And I wondered if in those dreams he still remembered who I was. If in his mind, I was still that little girl waiting for him at the door with open arms. That little girl who believed Dad could fix everything with just a hug. Neighbors began to notice my absence at church, at the market, at town events. I stopped attending dinners, birthday parties, any gathering that meant leaving my father alone for more than an hour. Some called me a saint. Others called me stupid. But no one offered to help. No one came forward with a hot meal or a sincere question about how I was. Because sometimes the one who always cares is also the most forgotten. And so the years passed. No photos, no trips, no memories I could hold on to beyond the smell of massage oil or the sound of the oximeter in the early morning. But I never complained, because I knew that when he was gone, I didn't want to be in debt to my own conscience. I wanted to have been there, to have given everything, even if it meant losing myself in the process. The funny thing is, I never expected anything from my sister. I didn't ask for her help. I didn't complain about her absence. But I did believe she'd at least respect what I did, that she wouldn't cross certain lines, that she wouldn't use our history for her own benefit, that she wouldn't be able to look the other way while I tore myself apart day by day to keep him alive. But I was wrong, and I would find out soon enough, in the dirtiest way, the cruelest, the most unexpected, with a bank card, with a password, with a flight to another continent, and with a lie that would uproot what little stability I had left. Because sometimes the pain doesn't come from losing someone. It comes from realizing you never had them. My sister and I grew up under the same roof, with the same rules, the same silences, the same long Sundays smelling of soup and waxed floors. But from a very young age, our lives began to take such different paths that I sometimes wondered if we had actually grown up in the same house. She was always the star, the one who effortlessly commanded attention. She had that way of looking that made people listen to her, respect her, even when she wasn't saying anything worthwhile. I, on the other hand, was the shadow, the one who cleared the dishes after dinner, the one who made sure everything was in order before going to sleep. It wasn't a matter of envy, at least not back then. It was just the way things were. If she broke something, Mom said it was an accident. If I did the same, it was clumsiness. If she got a bad grade, it was because the teacher didn't explain well. If it was me, it was because I didn't study hard enough. And so I learned to disappear, to be useful without being a nuisance, to carry the weight of what no one wanted to bear. My sister used to leave without saying goodbye. Ever since she was a teenager, she ran away to parties, to get-togethers, to lives that didn't belong to us. She had that ability to lie with a smile. She said she was going to study with friends, and she came back with perfume on her clothes and glassy eyes. My mother believed her. My father pretended not to notice. I was the only one who saw her walk past, as if she didn't exist, as if she were part of the furniture. When I turned 16, I was given a Bible and an apron. She was given a trip to New York with some friends from the private school where she attended. I worked weekends to help with the expenses. She spent more in a weekend than I did in an entire month, but no one mentioned it. No one questioned anything, because she was the bright daughter, the one who would go far, the one who had a future. And she went far. She left as soon as she could. She finished high school, and soon she was living in another state, with a boyfriend no one knew, and a poorly told story about a scholarship that never existed. She never really came back. She called at Christmas, maybe on a birthday. She sent messages with emojis and empty promises. She always said she was busy, that she'd visit soon, that she missed us so much. But she didn't come back. Not really. I stayed. I became the daughter who accompanies the doctor, the one who looks for prescriptions, the one who pays the bills, the one who sits in the waiting room while doctors pronounce difficult words that you don't want to understand. I grew up amidst pill bottles and doctor's appointments. I learned to hide my tiredness with a smile and my frustration with a cup of tea. When my mother fell ill, it was already clear that I was the only one available. The diagnosis was swift and merciless. A silent cancer that gave no time to prepare. She slowly faded away. I remember the way she would hold my hand at night, when she thought I was asleep, and whisper nonsense. Once, she mistook me for her dead sister. Another time, she asked me to forgive her for something I didn't understand. I didn't want to ask. I just wanted her to feel at peace. My sister came to the funeral dressed in black, with dark glasses, a designer coat, and smelling like the airport. She cried silently, hugged family members, and took a photo with a bouquet in her hand. And the next day, she was gone. I gathered her things from the guest room. She'd left behind a dirty cup and a half-empty box of chocolates. That was all that remained of her visit, of her mourning. It was that night, as I closed the curtains in Mom's room, that I promised my father I'd never leave him alone. He didn't ask. He didn't look me in the eye. He didn't beg. But I decided. Because I knew what was coming. Because I saw him slump that very day. I saw him stare into space as if he'd lost something more than his wife. As if he'd lost himself. And I couldn't look away. From that moment on, something changed in me. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a guardian. A kind of silent anchor that kept everything together. I took care of the bills, the insurance, the house maintenance. I called Dad's friends to keep him socially active. I organized dominoes games with the neighbors. I made his favorite meals. I cared for him like someone tending a weak flame that threatens to go out with every wind. My sister knew all this. I told her on the phone. Sometimes I sent her pictures of Dad eating ice cream or watching TV with a blanket on his lap. She responded with an emoji, a heart. A dad looks so cute, and nothing more. She didn't ask if we needed anything. She didn't offer help. She just said, "Let me know if anything serious happens." And so the years passed, between sugar-free breakfasts and pills that changed every 3 months, between calls to the doctor and arguments with the insurance company, between the smell of medicated talcum powder and fleeting visits from some distant aunt. Every day was a step closer to oblivion, and every day I became more convinced that I had done the right thing, that I was exactly where I should be. Until one day, out of the blue, she called saying she'd be coming over for a few days. She said she had some vacation time coming up and thought it was a good time to reconnect. I didn't believe her, but I feigned enthusiasm. I cleaned the guest room, laid out clean sheets, and made her favorite meal. When she arrived, carrying her expensive suitcases and her cell phone in her hand, she hugged me as if it hadn't been that long. During those days, I watched her look at the house with a stranger's eyes. She commented that we needed to replace the furniture, that the garden was neglected, that the kitchen was outdated. I laughed inside. She didn't know that I had repaired that furniture myself, that I kept that garden alive with rainwater, that the kitchen was the only place where I still felt in control. But what hurt me most was how she treated Dad, as if he were just another piece of furniture. She spoke to him loudly, as if he were deaf. She explained everything impatiently. She got annoyed when he repeated the same story for the 3rd time. One night, she rudely corrected him, and he looked down like a scolded child. At that moment, I knew she didn't know him anymore, that she'd lost him long ago, and that I was the only one who still saw the man behind the deterioration. After a week, she left as quickly as she'd arrived. She said she had commitments, that the flight couldn't wait. She said goodbye with a kiss on the cheek and a promise to return soon. But she didn't come back. Not physically. What did come back, a few months later, was something much more dangerous. Something that would come in the form of a bank number, a security code, a remote access code. And with that, she would take something neither she nor I imagined. She would take the last spark of trust that remained between us. The diagnosis came like a dry whisper in a white room. A neurologist with a tired voice told me my father had advanced Alzheimer's, as if he were announcing the week's weather forecast. I nodded silently, feeling something inside me clench. I didn't cry. I didn't ask how long. I didn't beg for solutions. I just grabbed the papers, the prescriptions, the explanatory brochures, and walked out on shaky legs as if they belonged to another body. I remember it was raining that day, and I waited at the bus stop with the documents tucked under my coat, feeling the water mix with the fear. That night, I sat across from him and made his favorite dinner, mashed potatoes with roast beef and a glass of warm milk. He ate in silence. He smiled a little. He asked if we'd already visited Mom in the hospital. Mom had been dead for 5 years. I didn't correct him. I told him she was resting. He looked at me tenderly and said she was always strong. Then he fell asleep in the chair. I covered him with a blanket and left him there for a while longer, because at that moment he seemed calmer than ever. The next day, I began to reorganize my life. I quit my job as a live-in caregiver. I spoke to my boss, who had known me for years. She looked at me sadly and said she understood. She gave me a big hug and an envelope with extra money. "For whatever comes," she said. I had no idea how much I would need it. I transformed our house into a sort of makeshift nursing home. I removed carpeting. I installed grab bars in the bathroom. I bought a second-hand orthopedic mattress. I put labels on the doors so he knew where everything was. I organized his medications in colorful boxes. I made him big posters with phrases like, "Today is Monday," or "We already had breakfast." I printed family photos and posted them on the wall next to their names. I became his borrowed memory. The first few months were chaotic. He forgot small things, then important things. He would get up in the middle of the night saying he had to go to work. He dressed in pants that were 20 years old. Sometimes he peed without realizing it. Other times he got lost in his own room. Once, he locked himself in the bathroom and couldn't remember how to open the door. I found him crying, curled up by the sink, repeating over and over that someone had locked him in. I learned to hold back my tears, to take a deep breath, to be patient when he asked me the same thing 20 times, to not despair when he didn't recognize me. Once, he said, "Miss, do you work here?" And my heart broke into 1,000 pieces. I told him yes, that I was his assistant, and he smiled with relief as if I had given him something important in return. He asked me if I had children. I told him no. He said it was a shame because I seemed like a good mother. Sometimes, in the afternoons, we'd go for walks around the block. He'd hold my arm tightly. He'd talk to me about the weather, the trees, the neighbors. He'd tell me he liked birds, that when he was young, he wanted to be a veterinarian. He'd always told me that story, even though it wasn't true. He never wanted to be a veterinarian. He was a mechanic. But I played along. I'd make up memories with him so his world wouldn't fall apart so quickly. The nights were the hardest part. He often woke up confused, yelling names, searching for keys that no longer existed. He walked around the house with a flashlight and an old radio. He said he had to go out and buy something, or that someone was waiting for him at the station. One early morning, I found him at the door with his jacket on and Mom's purse in his hand. He looked at me and said, "Let's go. The train won't wait." I approached slowly and told him it was late, that the train had left. He hung his head, defeated, like a chastised child. That night, he slept clutching the purse, as if it connected him to some piece of his past he hadn't yet lost. I started keeping a diary, not out of habit, but out of necessity. I wrote down everything that happened, every change, every forgotten word, every repeated word. It helped me stay in control. It helped me remember not to forget, too. Sometimes I drew pictures of his face while he slept. Or I jotted down phrases he'd said to me, like when he looked at me and said, "There are days when I feel so light I think I'm going to fly away." They seemed like unintentional poetry to me, as if his mind, still in ruins, had moments of lucidity that needed to be preserved. I sold the car. We didn't use it anymore. I used the money to pay for physical therapy, diapers, and nutritional supplements. I learned to do exercises with him at home, to read aloud to him, to play old music to stimulate his memory, to bathe him gently, speaking to him like a child, to shave his beard without scaring him. I became a nurse, therapist, cook, cleaner, psychologist, security guard, and above all, a daughter. The house adapted to our new needs. Everything had its place. Everything followed a routine. If something was out of order, he would get agitated. Once I moved a vase, and he spent hours looking for it. He said he couldn't sleep without it. I blamed myself for days. I put it back. I learned that for him, objects were anchors, that he needed to acknowledge how little he still remembered. That confusion distressed him more than any physical pain. I received few visitors. Friends drifted away. Family called occasionally, but no one came, except for a neighbor who brought me hot soup in the winter. She said she admired my strength. I smiled and thanked her, but inside, I felt like I was fading away, that I was invisible, that I didn't exist beyond that routine. Every so often, my sister would call. Quick conversations, perfunctory questions. "How's Dad? Do you need anything?" I answered in measured sentences. I didn't want to upset her. I didn't want to seem demanding. She'd say she was working too hard, that the stress was making her feel bad, that she wished she could do more. Then she'd upload a photo of herself on the beach or at a fancy dinner, and I'd swallow my anger like a stone. One afternoon, while I was giving him his snack, he looked at me with moist eyes and said, "I don't want to forget you." I squeezed his hand and told him it didn't matter, that even if he forgot me, I would always be there. That was the only promise I made in a firm voice, that I wouldn't leave, that I wouldn't abandon him, that his end wouldn't be lonely. And so I continued, day after day. No vacations, no outings, no complaints. Feeling tired? Yes, but with a heart filled with a love I couldn't explain. Until love wasn't enough. Until betrayal knocked unannounced. Until I realized that, while I devotedly took care of every detail, there was someone else using that effort for their own benefit. And that person carried my blood. The first signs didn't come with shouts or knocks on the door. They came in the form of small envelopes containing bank statements, papers with numbers I didn't recognize, names of establishments I'd never set foot in, luxury restaurants, international flights, spa retreats that cost more than 3 months of my shopping. At first, I thought it was a bank error, a mix-up. I called customer service. They put me on hold for over an hour. They passed me from one operator to another. Finally, an impersonal voice told me that all the transactions were authorized from my father's account. I hung up the phone and looked at that frail man sleeping on the couch with a blanket on his legs, oblivious to everything, to his own signature, to his own life, a shadow of what he once was. And I couldn't understand it. I checked the cards. Only one was in the wallet on the dresser, but the statement showed charges for an additional card. I vaguely remembered that, before his memory began to fail, my father had requested a duplicate. He had done so when he still trusted the family to act responsibly. Back then, we didn't know that forgetting would be a storm that would sweep everything away, nor that trust, once given, would be used as a weapon. I continued to investigate silently. I logged into the online account. I searched through old emails. I saw a mailing address change notification. It wasn't ours. It was an address in California. I checked the name of the recipient of the points I'd earned from shopping. It wasn't my name. It was my sister's. That's when the nausea rose in my stomach like a slow burn. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't accept it. I thought there must be another explanation. But everything pointed to her travels, to her luxuries, to her perfect silence as I was unraveling day by day, taking care of our father. I took a breath. I choked back tears. I scanned the activity again. Hotels in Dubai, jewelry stores in New York, cash withdrawals near her, a fine wine shop in Paris. Each location was another stab in the arm, an image that made sense with each click. I remembered a post of hers where she was in a jacuzzi overlooking the ocean. Behind her, a tray of sushi and champagne. I commented on that photo with a heart emoji that time. Now I wanted to erase it from my mind forever. I locked myself in the bathroom. I sat on the cold floor. And there I cried with the desperation of someone who feels that everything they held, everything they protected, was trampled on by someone they once trusted. It was as if betrayal had a face, her face, the voice that called me once a month, saying thank you for everything, wishing I could be there. The empty words that now sounded hollow, false, cruel. The next day, I decided to confront her. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep swallowing my blood while she smiled at me on the phone. I texted her. I asked her to call me urgently. She did. Her voice was bright, quick, as always. I asked her point blank if she had used Dad's card. There was a brief silence, then a nervous laugh. She said yes, but only for emergencies. Emergencies. That's what she called a trip to Bali, a designer handbag, a yoga class in India. I asked her to tell me how long she'd been doing this. She told me it had been a few months, but the bank statement said otherwise. It was almost 2 years of constant expenses. Almost 2 years in which I lived on the bare minimum, rationing food, looking for deals at pharmacies, while she flew first class. I told her that Dad wasn't in a position to authorize anything, that she had taken advantage of her condition. Her response was what hurt me the most. She said she deserved it, that she'd had a tough childhood too, that she needed to heal, that traveling was her way of doing it, that Dad didn't notice anything and that it didn't hurt anyone. I couldn't answer. I remained silent, trembling. The words caught in my throat. She kept talking, justifying herself, saying that I was always the victim, that I liked suffering. That's why I stayed, that she chose to live, and that if I had to use a little of Dad's money, it was just a form of compensation. I couldn't take it anymore. I hung up. I stared at the phone as if it had exploded, as if it were no longer an object, as if it were the weapon that had just pierced me. That night, I didn't sleep. I tossed and turned. I got up to check the documents again, to double-check that I wasn't exaggerating, that I hadn't dreamed it, that it was real, that it wasn't a confusion, that it wasn't paranoia. I went to Dad's room. He was asleep. He was breathing heavily. I stroked his hair. I thought of all the times I'd bathed him with lukewarm water. I'd read him stories. I'd wiped his face with a wet washcloth when he'd had a fever. And I couldn't understand how someone claiming to be his daughter, his blood, had been able to turn him into an ATM while his body deteriorated day by day. At dawn, I felt like something inside me had finally broken. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was something deeper, darker, a mixture of helplessness and disappointment that I didn't know where to place. I walked through the house. I stopped in front of a photo of us when we were little girls, both of us in matching dresses, smiling, innocent. I tore it out of the picture frame in anger. I couldn't bear that lie hanging on the wall. I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't keep silent. My father deserved dignity, and I deserved respect, not only for what he did, but for what he had given. Years of my life, health, youth, dreams. Everything had been put on hold so he wouldn't die alone. So his end wouldn't be just any hospital bed. And now, while I sacrificed every part of me, she rewarded herself with pleasures that weren't hers. I started gathering evidence, printing bank statements, documenting conversations, saving messages. I was no longer just a caregiver. I became a witness, a whistleblower, the voice that could no longer be ignored. Because when love is used as a shield for abuse, it ceases to be love. It becomes a prison. And I no longer wanted to remain a prisoner of silence. For weeks, I walked around the house like a shadow, documents in hand, a permanent knot in my chest. There was something deeply disturbing about the idea of exposing my own sister. It wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was also a moral conflict. I struggled between the need for justice and the weight of feeling like I was about to break something sacred. But every time I entered my father's room and saw him asleep with his mouth half open, vulnerable, oblivious to everything, I reminded myself that it wasn't just a choice, it was an obligation. I started by going to a pro bono lawyer. He was an older man with thick glasses and a calm voice. He listened to me for over an hour. He didn't interrupt, he just took notes. When I finished, he lowered his glasses, looked me in the eyes, and said with a coldness I hadn't expected, This is financial abuse. I felt that sentence cut through me like a knife, not out of surprise, but out of confirmation. It was real. It was illegal. And there was a name for what was happening. He explained to me that using the funds of a person with a mental disability without their explicit consent was a serious crime. That even if she was part of the family, that didn't exempt her. He told me about power of attorney, fiduciary representation, and asset protection. Words I'd only heard in movies or read on forums I'd ignored. But that day I swallowed them like someone swallowing bitter medicine because I knew it was the only option for survival. I returned home with a folder full of documents. I sat down at the table with a notebook and started planning. I called the bank. I requested an immediate block on the additional card. I requested a password change for all the accounts. I reviewed every subscription, every automatic payment, every minimum charge. I closed the doors she had opened without permission, and although my hands were shaking, I felt a small spark of control return to me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something for myself. Not just caring, not just enduring, but taking action. That same week, I called her. I told her everything was canceled, that I knew every detail, every expense, every flight, every transaction. At first, she laughed. She said I was exaggerating, that I was paranoid. I told her I had proof, that I'd spoken to a lawyer, that it wasn't just a game anymore, that this had consequences. That's when her tone changed. Her voice became drier, more distant. She said if she wanted to make a scandal out of it, go ahead. That she wasn't afraid. That she had her own lawyers. That she could prove Dad had given her permission. I replied that Dad was no longer in a position to give permission. That she knew that better than anyone. That was precisely what made her guilty. We hung up without saying goodbye. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. But it was also necessary. There was no more room for masks, for hypocrisy, for fake dinners or empty phone calls. From that moment on, the only thing that mattered was protecting what was left of Dad, and protecting me. I spent the next few days sorting through paperwork, seeking support, speaking with a social worker who guided me on how to request an official evaluation of her mental capacity. The process was slow, bureaucratic, tiring, but I moved forward, step by step, as I always had, with patience, with firmness, with that silent strength that only emerges when there's no other way out. I remember one afternoon, while I was changing my father's socks, he grabbed my wrist. His gaze was clouded but intense. He said to me for no apparent reason, "Don't let them bandage me." It was a phrase that froze me, not because he knew what was happening, but because in some corner of his confused mind, his instinct still knew something wasn't right. I hugged him. I told him no one would bandage him, that he was safe, but inside, the promise weighed like a rock. I started receiving letters from the bank confirming the changes, legal notifications, responses to my complaints. Each envelope I opened was one step further from manipulation, one step closer to repair. But each letter was also an open wound, because it forced me to accept that sometimes the enemy isn't out there. It's in the family, in that person you thought would see you through the storms. But instead, it was the one who pushed you into the water. It wasn't easy to sleep during that time. I had recurring nightmares. I dreamed that my sister came into the house and took my father away in the middle of the night, that she pushed him onto a plane and he looked for me as he disappeared through the window. Other times, I dreamed that he regained his memory for a moment, only to tell me it was all my fault, that I had lost everything because I trusted too much. I woke up drenched in sweat, clutching the pillow as if it were a lifeline. I grew more rigid, more alert. Every sound in the house startled me. Every new email made me catch my breath. But I didn't stop, because I knew this time it wasn't just a matter of love. It was a matter of dignity, of justice, of protecting someone who could no longer defend themselves, and of also protecting that part of me that had been ignored, underestimated, forgotten for years. Over time, I managed to regain full control of the finances. I closed unnecessary accounts. I reviewed wills. I appointed a legal guardian. I officially became Dad's guardian. Not out of ambition, not out of a need for power, but because it was the only way to ensure that no more would be stolen from him. Not his money, not his memory, not his dignity. One night, as I was making tea in the kitchen, my father appeared in the doorway. He looked at me intently and said, "You're my daughter, aren't you?" I nodded with a smile. He leaned closer, caressed my face, and whispered, "Thank you for not letting me go." My whole soul trembled. I didn't know if he said it from a place of clarity or from some warm corner of his shadowed mind, but those words were enough. They were worth more than any forgiveness, more than any judgment. And I understood that although my sister had taken many things from me, she couldn't take away what was essential, what I built with every gesture, with every dawn, with every tear hidden behind a smile. No one can steal that, because what is given from true love remains, even if it hurts, even if it leaves scars, even if betrayal comes from the same place you once called home. I began to notice changes in my body. They weren't sudden or dramatic. They were silent, like everything else in my life lately. A fatigue that didn't go away after sleeping. A pain in my back that didn't go away with massages or heat. Sudden dizziness. A pressure in my chest that forced me to sit down every so often. And worst of all, a kind of mental emptiness, as if my memory were starting to play tricks on me. At first, I attributed it to fatigue, then to tension. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Caring for someone who's sick takes an invisible toll. There are no schedules, no real breaks, no Sundays. Your body lives in a state of constant alert. Even while you sleep, there's a part of you that's awake, waiting for the sound of a bang, a groan, a fall. I lived with my heart racing, with my hands always ready to hold it, to clean it, to prevent an accident. No one trains you for that. And much less, no one prepares you for what it does to you. One day, while preparing lunch, I fainted. It wasn't a mild dizziness. It was a full-body fall onto the kitchen floor. I woke up with my face pressed against the cold tile and my arm numb. The clock read more than an hour since I'd last looked at the stove. The rice had burned. Dad was still asleep, oblivious to everything. I dragged myself to the bathroom, washed my face, looked in the mirror and saw a woman I didn't recognize. Dark circles under my eyes, paleness, a look of defeat. It wasn't just fatigue. It was the beginning of collapse. I went to the doctor. They ran tests, scans, CT scans. Everything was the same. My body was crying out for help. I was at my limit. The doctor was clear. I needed rest. I needed help. He said if I continued like this, I'd end up hospitalized. And then, who would take care of Dad? I laughed. I told him I had no choice. He insisted. He told me about day centers, home care, community support. I just nodded. But inside, it all sounded distant, unreal, inaccessible. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by Dad's bed and watched him for hours. He breathed slowly, with that raspy sound that was so familiar to me. I wondered if it was worth all the sacrifice. If I was really helping him or just dragging him with me toward a slow, painful abyss. I thought about my life before all this, about what I dreamed of, what I wanted, and then I thought about what it had made of me, a shadow of what I once was, a body on autopilot, a heart that never paused. I decided to seek help. I started with the closest possible source. I went to the local parish. I spoke with a volunteer who coordinated a support group for caregivers. She listened attentively. She gave me a brochure. She invited me to a meeting. I hesitated, but I went. And there, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. There were 7 of us, each with our own story, our own burden, our own silences. There was a woman caring for her mother with Parkinson's, a man living with his wife who had schizophrenia, an elderly woman caring for her son with cerebral palsy. We all had something in common: fatigue, guilt, the fear of asking for help. Listening to their stories made me see mine through different eyes. I wasn't alone. I wasn't weak. I wasn't selfish for needing a break. I was human. And that saved me. I started going every week. They gave me advice. They offered me connections. They hugged me without judgment. I came home with tears in my eyes. but with my soul a little less burdened. One day, one of the volunteers told me about a local government program, home care for older adults with dementia. It wasn't much, a couple of hours a day, but it was something. I filed the paperwork. Social workers visited me. Dad was assessed. He was accepted. And the first time the caregiver arrived, I felt like I was breathing for the first time in years. She was a young, kind, patient woman. She knew how to treat Dad. She combed his hair. She read to him. She sang him old songs. And I, during those 2 hours, would go for a walk. I would sit in a square. I would drink a coffee. I would read a book. I would call a friend. I would cry silently. I would reconnect with myself. It wasn't much, yes, but he was mine. My health slowly improved. My body still ached, but it no longer collapsed. My soul was still broken, but there were days when I managed to smile. And through it all, I continued to face the legal proceedings against my sister. Her lawyers sent letters. She blocked me from all sides. Word spread through the family. Some believed me. Others accused me of exaggerating. I lost ties. I gained respect. I stood firm. Dad didn't ask about her. He no longer remembered her name. Sometimes he mistook her for a neighbor, or a nurse, or he simply didn't mention her. And that hurt, because even though her memory was fading, her absence was so strong that it became silence. A silence that screamed. I learned to live with that absence, to expect nothing, to not need explanations. I understood that not everyone has the capacity to bear the pain, that there are those who run away, that there are those who protect themselves behind selfishness. And while that doesn't justify their actions, it helps to release the weight one didn't choose to carry. I found small moments of peace. A sunny afternoon, a song I made Dad sing, a warm soup, a supportive message, a carefree night. I learned to appreciate the smallest things, because in the world of caregiving, the smallest things can mean everything. A calm breath, a smile, a thank you. And I realized over time that I wasn't just taking care of my father. I was rebuilding myself, piece by piece, with every decision, with every step, with every act of love that needed no witnesses or rewards. Because in the end, that was what sustained me. Love, the real kind, the kind that is given when no one is looking, the kind that is given without expecting anything, the kind that remains when everything else is gone. There were days when I felt like everything was suspended in time, as if the house had become a capsule where the clock didn't mark the hours, but rather the routines. Waking Dad up, changing his clothes, making breakfast, giving him his medication, cleaning, reading to him, putting him to sleep, and so on, over and over again. The repetitiveness became a refuge, but also a prison, because in that rigid structure, where every minute was anticipated, there was no room for surprises or for dreams. Sometimes, while I was with him on the couch, I would find myself staring out the window for long periods of time. I would watch the sun sweep across the yard. I would watch the leaves fall from the trees in autumn. I would watch the neighbors walk by with grocery bags. Every external gesture became a silent film that reminded me there was a whole world out there, a world that kept turning while mine seemed to stand still. It was during one of those silences that I began to write. At first, they were just loose sentences in an old notebook, fleeting thoughts, memories I didn't want to forget. Then they were paragraphs, reflections, imaginary dialogues with Mom, letters to myself. Without realizing it, I found in writing a way to let go, to avoid exploding, to avoid becoming a woman filled with rage who one day would no longer recognize her own voice. Writing allowed me to organize the chaos, to name the pain, the exhaustion, the betrayal, and also the love. Because in the midst of it all, there was tenderness, brief but intense moments that sustained me, like when Dad, in a burst of lucidity, asked me if I was his angel, or when he took my hand and squeezed it tightly without saying anything, or when he laughed at a song he didn't even know I remembered. They were seconds, but they were enough to keep me going. One afternoon, while I was combing his hair, he asked me if I had a husband. I told him no. He looked at me with a mixture of sadness and surprise. He said that a woman like me shouldn't be alone, that someone should take care of me too. That phrase kept echoing in my head for days, because it was true. I needed to be taken care of too. But I had gotten so used to being the strong one, the one who endures, the one who can handle everything, that I no longer knew how to ask for help. I didn't even know how to receive it. Emotional isolation had become part of my routine. I had lost friends, not because of fights, but because of a lack of time, of energy, of desire. The invitations dwindled until they disappeared. The messages no longer arrived, and I stopped looking for them. Not because I didn't need them, but because I felt I couldn't offer anything in return. What could I tell them? That my life consisted of lifting diapers and managing medications? That I hadn't gone outside for weeks except to do some quick shopping? That my greatest moment of freedom was walking from my bedroom to the patio while he slept? But there was also something deeper, a fear, of feeling forgotten, of accepting that maybe no one thought about me anymore, that the world had gone on without me. And that hurt, more than the physical exhaustion, more than my sister's betrayal. It hurt to think that one day I would disappear and no one would notice, that I would dissolve within the walls of this house, like the smell of soup or the sound of the kitchen timer. It was in the midst of that feeling that I decided to do something I'd never thought possible. I called a childhood friend. Years had passed. Her voice on the other end of the phone was warm, excited, but also full of surprise. She told me she'd thought about me many times, that she hadn't dared to write because she didn't want to disturb me, that she assumed I didn't want to talk to anyone. I cried. I cried while she told me about her children, her work, her life. And I cried harder when she told me she admired me, that she always knew I was brave, and that she was proud of me. That call changed something in me. I started allowing myself small get-togethers, replying to texts, accepting a coffee, even a quick one, receiving a hug without feeling like I had to justify being tired or disheveled. And every gesture, no matter how small, gave me back a little piece of myself. A neighbor I barely knew left a plant on my doorstep with a note that said, "For your window, may it never stop blooming." That day, Dad had a fever. I spent the whole night changing wet cloths, monitoring his temperature, talking to the doctor on the phone. But in the midst of that anguished early morning, I looked at the plant and smiled, because there was something in that flower that endured, just like me. Little by little, I learned to talk about my pain without shame, to say I was exhausted without feeling weak, to acknowledge that I needed a break without feeling guilty. I joined caregiver forums, I read blogs, I shared my story, and every time someone responded with a "me too," I felt like I was no longer alone. I didn't stop caring for Dad. I didn't stop being that daughter who loved him with every fiber of her being. But I also began to be a woman, a person, a human being, someone with needs, with desires, with limits. I understood that caring for myself wasn't betraying him. It was ensuring that I could continue caring for him from a healthy place, that I couldn't give if I was empty, that I couldn't hold on if I fell. And so, between routines and pauses, between tears and small bursts of hope, I began to rebuild myself. Without grand plans, without grandiloquent promises, only with the firm determination not to lose myself, not to forget myself while I cared for him, because he deserved to be remembered. He deserved to exist, even if it was on the margins, even if no one noticed, even if the world kept turning without me. I was still here, and that was already a form of resistance. There was one particular night I'll never forget. It was winter. The wind was beating against the windows as if it wanted to get in. Everything was dark. Dad had a cough, one of those dry coughs that left his chest tight and his gaze vacant. We had spent the entire day in the emergency room because he seemed to have an infection. We returned home late, with a bag of medicine, a prescription, and a warning from the doctor. His lungs were weak, very weak. He warned me that I should monitor him constantly, as if I didn't already. I made him a light soup. I changed his clothes. I fluffed his pillows. I put on the humidifier. I sat down next to him with a blanket. And I stayed there, all night, sleepless, counting his breaths, listening to every sigh, glancing at the clock every 15 minutes. And in the midst of that wakefulness, I realized it had been a long time since I'd slept deeply. Not physically or emotionally. I was always on alert, in survival mode, as if something could go wrong at any moment. And that feeling accompanied me throughout everything. In the food I swallowed without tasting it, in the days that passed without me remembering the date, in the forgotten birthdays, in the calls I didn't return. Everything had become urgent, essential, limited to what was necessary to survive. I realized I was no longer living. I was just resisting, like a ship in the middle of a storm that doesn't know if it will reach the shore. But also, that same night, I felt something else. A kind of unexpected calm. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't relief. It was acceptance. As if, after so much pain, I'd come to understand that this was my life, that I was here for a reason, that caring for my father wasn't just a punishment or a burden. It was also a choice. A painful one, yes, but mine. Because I could have left. I could have done like my sister. I could have closed my eyes, but I didn't. I stayed. And that permanence, that silent loyalty, gave me strength. I thought about everything that had changed since I found out about the card, since I discovered that uncomfortable truth, since I broke the bond with my sister. It was like opening a box that couldn't be closed again, because it wasn't just the betrayal anymore. It was what forced me to look at myself, my limits, my wounds, my capacity to love even when everything hurt. And I also thought of Mom, of that figure who was no longer with us, but who sometimes appeared in my memories so clearly that I could smell her perfume. I remembered a phrase she used to say when I was a child: "True love isn't shown with flowers, but with presence." And she was right, because in these years, I've learned that being there is an act of love deeper than any pretty words. That being there for someone in their decline, in their fragility, in their confusion, is the purest form of affection there is. Dad murmured things in his sleep. Names, places, songs. Sometimes he called me by Mom's name. Other times by the name of an aunt who died decades ago. I only responded with caresses, with gentle words, with that patience I learned to cultivate when I understood that the mind goes before the body, that sometimes only the echo of what we once were remains, and that we must learn to love even that echo. I also began to notice that his gaze was becoming more distant, that his moments of lucidity were becoming less frequent, that his body was beginning to refuse to continue. And although this broke my heart, it also prepared me, because I knew the time would come, that I would have to say goodbye, that I wouldn't be able to stop it. And I didn't want his end to be only sadness. I wanted him to know that, until his last breath, he was accompanied, that he wasn't forgotten, that he wasn't abandoned like so many elderly people who die alone in a hospital, staring at white ceilings and listening to machines instead of the voices of their loved ones. So I started telling him stories, reading things he used to enjoy. I told him about our trips when I was a kid, about the movies we watched on VHS, about how he taught me to ride a bike, about how he once rescued me from a storm when I was scared. And he, though he didn't always respond, would sometimes let out a small laugh, or a tear, or a nod. And I felt like, for seconds, he was back. I also realized that the house needed air, life. So I opened the windows. I played soft music. I bought a bouquet of flowers. I prepared a special meal. And even though Dad barely touched it sometimes, I felt alive. Because in the midst of pain, one also has the right to beauty, to hope, to the simple gestures that remind us that we are still human. One day, as I was helping him dress, he took my arm and said thank you. Just that, with moist eyes. I don't know if he knew why he said it. I don't know if he understood all that it implied. But for me, it was enough. I felt like all the effort, all the sacrifice, all the tears were worth it for that single moment. Because in the end, one doesn't live for great rewards. One lives for those brief moments where one soul connects with another, where love, although silent, is present. And it was in those days, in the midst of that routine as hard as it was sacred, that I began to write not just for myself. I began to write for other people, for other daughters, other sons, for those who care and don't know how to continue, for those who love without being seen, for those who give without expecting anything, because I understood that my story wasn't just mine, it was that of thousands, and that if by sharing it I could ease even a little of someone else's burden, then everything made sense. So, as Dad's body slowly shut down, something in me rekindled. It wasn't happiness, but it was light. And in a world so full of darkness, a spark can be all we need to keep walking. Even if it's with dragging feet, even if it's crying, even if it's in silence. Because what's important isn't how we move forward, but that we move forward, that we don't give up, that we're still here, for love, and also for ourselves. The morning that changed everything started no differently than any other. The sky was gray, as if it sensed what was coming. I prepared breakfast, as always, warm porridge with apple, his favorite. I touched his forehead, a little warmer than usual. I thought maybe it was a mild cold, another of those small daily battles. But there was something different about his eyes. They weren't lost like other days. They were fixed. They were looking at me. And in that instant, for a brief second, I felt like he recognized me. He moved his hand slowly and placed it on mine. He didn't say anything. He just held me. It wasn't physical strength. It was something more, as if he knew there wasn't much time left and wanted to leave one last mark on me. I sat down next to him. I told him once again about my childhood. I told him about Mom, about our afternoons playing, about the times I would get up to watch the fireworks. I felt like every word had weight, as if it were part of a silent ritual between us. Hours passed. He was breathing heavily. I called the doctor. I explained the symptoms. He asked me to take him to the hospital, but I knew he didn't want that. Not this time. Not in his condition. Not with tubes or cold lights. Not surrounded by machines. He had lived with dignity and deserved to leave with the same. I sat by his bed, tucked him in tightly, and put on some soft music. An old song Mom used to sing. The room filled with a thick, almost sacred silence. I didn't cry. Not then. I just breathed with him. I followed his every inhalation, every exhalation, as if I could stretch out his time with the force of my will. As night fell, his breaths became more spaced out, softer, and finally, in a sigh that was almost a whisper, he was gone. There was no drama, no final words, just that last breath that pierced my soul. I stayed still, holding him, caressing his face. It took me several minutes to understand that he was gone, that it was no longer my father's body, but his absence, that now filled the room. The whole house seemed to shut down. Even the clock stopped ticking. I got up, walked automatically to the phone, and made the call. I notified the doctor. I notified the funeral home. I did it with a calmness I didn't know I possessed, as if the whole storm had already passed inside and now only the echo remained. When they took his body, I felt like a part of my chest was being ripped out, but I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I just stood there, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, as if I could still protect him. It hurt even to breathe, but at the same time, there was something I couldn't explain. A peace, as if everything finally made sense, as if, after so much struggle, his soul was finally at rest. And mine too, at least for a moment. That night, the first without him, was the longest of my life. I named every corner of the house. His cup, his shoes, his cane, the chair by the window. I struggled to walk without looking for him, as if he were still there, hidden, playing at surprising me. I sat with his blanket over my legs, and I cried. I cried like I hadn't in years. I cried for him, for me, for everything we didn't say, for what we did, for what we lost, for what we endured. Over the next few days, I busied myself organizing everything. The wake, the paperwork, the bills, the calls. I received flowers. I received silence. Some relatives showed up out of obligation. Others didn't. My sister didn't call, she didn't text, she didn't ask, and that hurt, but not like before. I wasn't expecting anything anymore. I just watched, like someone watching a wound slowly heal. During the burial, I clung to the coffin like someone clinging to their last certainty. I listened to the priest, the prayers, the words of comfort that sound so hollow in those moments. But the only thing that mattered to me was the wind, that wind that seemed to caress me, as if telling me I was okay, that I had arrived, that it no longer hurt. I returned home alone. I opened the door as if it were a new threshold, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of silence as a presence, not as a threat, but as a reality. There was no one to care for anymore, no one calling me from the other room, no one who needed my hands, my eyes, my constant attention. The house was still the same, but everything had changed. That night, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't turn on any lamps. I just sat in the dark, and I allowed myself to do nothing, absolutely nothing, not to think, not to plan, not to resist, just to exist. I felt like I was standing in front of a door that had always been there, but I'd never been able to open it. The door to my life, the one I'd put off, the one I'd closed to take care of someone else. And now, finally, I could see what was on the other side. It was strange. There was freedom, but also vertigo. Because when you live so long for and by someone else, you forget yourself. And in reclaiming space, you also face emptiness. The questions. Who am I now? What do I want? Where am I going? I felt like a girl in a woman's body, with deep scars, with a history on my shoulders, but also with an opportunity, with the possibility of choice. I started with the small things, sorting papers, donating clothes, painting a wall, going for a walk aimlessly, breathing deeply without guilt, listening to the silence without fear. And in each of those actions, I felt him, as if his love hadn't disappeared. It had merely transformed into courage, into memory, into strength. I kept his watch in a box, his favorite handkerchief, a pair of old shoes, not to hold on to the past, but to honor it. Because everything I experienced with him, every tear, every sleepless night, every gesture, shaped me, transformed me, showed me what I'm made of. And I understood that there's no right way to say goodbye, that grief has no rules, that healing isn't forgetting, it's remembering without breaking. It's carrying what you've experienced inside like a beacon, not a chain. It's looking at the world again with fresh eyes, with gratitude, with compassion, with that mix of sadness and hope that only those who have loved until the end know. After Dad left, the days began to pass as if someone had unraveled them. They had no shape, no direction, no clear purpose. I woke up because my body did so out of habit. I moved around the house without needing to think. It was like inhabiting an empty structure that had once been filled with tasks, sounds, and emergencies, and now held only echoes. I would find myself calling him in a low voice out of inertia. I would check the kitchen as if I had to prepare something for him. I would open his medicine drawer only to remember there were no more doses to administer. But it wasn't sadness that dominated. It was confusion. I had lost the axis around which my existence revolved. For years, every decision I made was conditioned by her well-being. Now, I had the freedom I had longed for, but I didn't know what to do with it. It was as if someone had given me a one-way ticket to anywhere in the world, but I didn't know where to go because I no longer remembered who I was. The first few weeks, I dedicated myself to cleaning, deeply, not just the house, but also my mind. I threw away old papers. I donated clothes. I reorganized the closets. I got rid of things we kept only out of habit. And in the midst of that physical process, I also began an emotional decluttering process. I wrote letters to Mom, Dad, even my sister. I didn't send them, but I needed to get those words out. I needed to say that it hurt, that I felt betrayed, that I also felt guilty for hating her, for judging her, for not having reached out for her at some point. Everything I had kept quiet for years, I put on paper. One day, I decided to go out. I walked to the neighborhood square, I sat on a bench in the sun. I watched people go by. I saw children playing, couples arguing, older people reading the newspaper. It was like rediscovering the world from scratch. Everything had a different glow. Not because it was better, but because for the first time in a long time, I was seeing it with my own eyes, not through the filter of care or urgency. A couple of weeks later, a neighbor knocked on my door. She was bringing me a freshly baked loaf of bread. She told me she'd read in the community group that my father had passed away. She hugged me without saying much. That simple gesture touched me deeply. Not because of the bread, but because it was the first time someone had acknowledged my grief in a simple human way. Not with cliches, not with formalities, just with presence. That hug opened something in me. It reminded me that I was alive, that I could still connect, that there was a world beyond loss. I started frequenting the community center. I volunteered to help with Saturday meals. Cooking for others gave me back a sense of usefulness I'd lost. I wasn't just a caregiver anymore. I was Helena, a woman with hands, with stories, with time to give and receive. One day, during one of those community cooking sessions, I was asked if I could share my story. I didn't know what to say at first. I thought I had nothing to say, that everything I experienced was private, intimate, too painful. But then I remembered all the nights I'd spent searching the internet for testimonies from people like me, from daughters who cared, from exhausted women, from hearts that loved in silence. And I realized that my story could also be a mirror for someone else. I agreed. I sat in front of a small group, and I spoke, my voice trembling, my heart open, no frills. I told them what it was like to take care of Dad, how I found out about my sister, how it all hurt, how it still hurt, but also how I began to rebuild myself. There were tears, yes, but also smiles, looks that said, "So do I," and that was healing. From then on, I began to write with more intention. I started a blog. I called it Invisible Daughters. Every week I published a post, not only about my experience, but also about reflections, tools, emotions. Soon, messages began to arrive. From women, from men, from caregivers, from lonely people, from distant daughters, each with a different story but a similar pain. I realized that loneliness comes in many forms, but that sharing the word can build bridges. I began receiving invitations to speak in other venues, in schools, in associations, in churches. My story, which I had previously thought had no value, was now helping others put a name to what they were feeling. And every time someone thanked me for sharing what I couldn't explain, I felt like all the weight I'd carried for years hadn't been in vain. One day, while walking through the market, I saw a notebook with a sunflower on the cover. It reminded me of an afternoon with Dad in the garden. I bought it. On the first page, I wrote this sentence: "I wasn't lost, I was transformed." And I felt that, in some way, this was my deepest truth, because I didn't emerge from that process the same. Nor did I intend to be. I lost many things. Yes, time, youth, projects, connections. But I also gained a strength I didn't know existed within me, a sense of compassion that made me look at the world with different eyes, a commitment to life, to memory, to the dignity of those we love until the end. Sometimes when people ask me if I'd do the same thing again, if I'd choose to stay by Dad's side again, I answer yes. Not because it was easy, not because he hasn't broken me 1,000 times, but because that love, though painful, gave me an identity. It taught me what it means to be, what it means to be. And now, as I reinvent myself in this new phase, as I discover what I want, where I'm going, how to rebuild myself, I do so with the certainty that my story didn't end with their departure. On the contrary, it's just beginning. Because after accompanying someone until their last breath, one learns that living isn't just about breathing. It's about choosing. It's about feeling. It's about being present. And I, for the first time in a long time, am choosing myself. Sometimes I find myself silent, staring out the window as if waiting for something. A message, a sign, a word. But then I remember that life doesn't always respond as we expect. That answers often come in the form of encounters, brave decisions, silences we learn to hear, and that true love, the kind that leaves a deep mark, continues to speak even when there's no longer a voice to speak it. I've learned to live with absence without letting it become a pit, to walk with memories without letting them drag me down, to smile at the past without letting it steal my present, because every day I wake up wanting to move on, with the intention of taking care of myself as I once did for him. I'm honoring not only his memory, but also my story. I'm telling the world that despite everything, I'm still here, whole, different, but standing. There are days when I miss him so much that my chest aches like a torn muscle, but there are also days when I remember him with tenderness, with gratitude, with a smile. I like to think that, from wherever he is, he can see what I'm doing, that he's proud, that he understands that everything I went through wasn't in vain, that his passing pushed me to find myself amid the rubble of what's left behind. To all the people who have written to me, who have shared their own stories, who have cried with me from the other side of the screen, I want to say something very simple, but very true. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for feeling. Thank you for not leaving me alone on this journey. Because although my story began in solitude, it is now woven with hundreds of voices that accompany me, that understand me, that embrace me from afar. And if you, who are reading this, made it this far, I also want to thank you. Because it's not easy to face another person's pain. It's not easy to confront your own wounds through someone else's words. But you did it. You are here. And that says a lot about your heart. You are not alone. You are not alone. There is an invisible network that unites us, a shared memory that sustains us. If you've ever felt like you've given more than you've received, if you've ever cared for someone without anyone noticing, if you've held back your tears for fear of appearing weak, if you've stood up when everything hurt, if you've loved in silence, then this story is yours too. Because what I experienced isn't unique, it's universal, it's human. It's a reflection of so many who give their all without expecting applause. And now, as I close this chapter, I do so with a lighter soul, with the certainty that pain can be transformed into a bridge. That loss is also a portal, that by telling my story, I have opened the door for many others to find their voice, their strength, their courage. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I don't have all the answers, but I know I want to keep walking, telling, listening, healing, because every shared story is a seed, and I want to keep sowing. If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself reflected in it, if you felt something that moved you inside, I invite you to stay here with me, to stay in this space where emotions are real, where wounds aren't hidden, and where love, even in its most painful forms, remains the force that moves us. Thank you for being there. Thank you for feeling. And thank you for allowing this story to live on in you too. Now, if you feel like your soul needs to hear something else, I invite you to watch the next video on the screen. Perhaps there you'll find other words to embrace you, another story to keep you company, another story to remind you that even in the darkness, there is light, and that as long as we keep telling, we'll keep resisting, we'll keep loving, we'll keep living. With all my heart, thank you, and see you in the next story.